we're going to cover a very essential aspect of web development, cookies. We're trying to solve persistent state in a way that makes it easy for us to access it either on the client environment or on the server environment. To understand what cookies are, essentially is cookies are data stored on the client's browser that travels back and forth on every request and response. Essentially, the client will always have access to the cookies because cookies live there. Essentially, that is where the browser will store them, and it will always send them as part of the request. So the server on its side will always have access to it because it can access the request data. And for that, I want to show you two sample sections of the application that deal with the outflow. So the first thing that I'd like to show you is the login form component. Remember that the login form component is a very simple one. It shows you two fields, and you can toggle it into between a login form and a sign up form. We're not going to care about that particular case right now. Just we want to see what happens when we click on the login button. What I want to focus on is the handle login function. This function gets executed whenever you click on the login button, and what it does is it will perform a fetch request to our login endpoint, and it will be a post request. It will send the user and the password information, and then it will get the response back. If the response has an error, then it will show an error. Otherwise, it will perform a redirect to the list. We're not dealing here with cookies, but look at what happens on the server side. This is your standard API endpoint for Next. We're exposing a post endpoint. We are getting the username and the password. We're just calling a login function. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's just querying the database and doing some operations. It doesn't really matter. But if there is no user found, we'll respond with that message. There is either the username or the password are incorrect. We don't really care. However, if there is no problem, and if we've actually found a user, what we're going to do is we're going to create a cookie called logged, and we're going to save inside that cookie the user ID, the ID of the user in the database. That is all the information that I want to store in the cookie at this stage. Notice that I'm using the cookies function, which gets imported from a Next helper. Next gives you all the tools you need to deal with cookies on the backend. So this is definitely a very simple way of doing it. You don't need, for the backend operations, you don't need any external libraries or anything. We will look into one for the front end though. And as you saw before, if we send back a response that has no errors, which is our case here, then the front end will assume that the cookie got created and it will redirect us to the list component. Let's look at how you will use that information on the client. Let's look at how to use the cookies, as in the state stored in the cookies on the client side. Now, to show you how to use the cookies on the client, I want to show you the auth context that I created. This auth context handles essentially any operations around the piece of information I just showed you, the logged cookie. That's all it does. But you across your components, you will need to know the user ID potentially. You will need to know if the user is logged in or not, and you will need functions such as the logout function that destroys the cookie. We're going to have an internal state called token, and that variable is going to contain the actual user ID when the cookie exists. So what I do is, on the moment that my context provider gets mounted on the DOM, it will check for cookies using the proper name, the logged cookie, and if there is something there, then it will grab that value and set it as part of its internal state. The provider obviously is sharing that internal state, is sharing the functions called is logged, login, and logout. The login function allows you to set the cookie to whatever you want, essentially, if you want to, and then the is logged is a Boolean function that will return true if the internal state has a value. Otherwise, it will return false. And the logout function will remove the cookie and the internal state. Now, another interesting point of consideration is that remember that state is just a value in memory in your browser. So if we were just to somehow pass the state using the login function or whatever other potential function that we might create and set that value from a client component, a simple refresh will clear that value. That is why we're also dependent on the cookie. We need to persist that state for two reasons. Why? To make sure that the state is accessible, like I said before, from both environments, client and server. But we also need to make sure that a simple action such as refresh of the page or just navigating from one page to the other with a full refresh of the application doesn't kill our internal state. And it actually does, but with this use effect hook, we're actually able to reload that state and make sure that the entire app has access to it again.